December 21st, 1944. It was 6:12 in the morning. The air over Malmedy, Belgium, felt like shards of broken glass. Each breath cut cold, sharp, and shallow. The horizon was a pale bruise of gray-blue light before dawn, the kind of light that belongs to a world caught between night and memory. Snow drifted soundlessly across ruins where chimneys once stood, coating shattered brick and twisted iron beams with a fragile white calm that did nothing to hide the violence beneath. The world, in that corner of Belgium, had been turned inside out. Smoke clung to the ruins like ghosts that refused to leave. The war had swallowed the familiar, leaving behind only silence and the mechanical sigh of the wind through hollow windows. Inside, what remained of an abandoned coal processing plant, a skeleton of concrete and steel stripped bare by artillery fire, a young American soldier crouched beside a blown-out doorway. His name was Francis Sherman Curry, 19 years old. Too young, perhaps, for the kind of day that waited for him. His breath came in ragged clouds, freezing before it disappeared into the air. In his frostbitten hands, he held a single-shot bazooka, borrowed, untested, possibly faulty. Slung low across his back hung a .30 caliber machine gun that rattled softly against his gear every time he shifted his weight. Around him, the factory floor was littered with debris, twisted rebar, frozen mud, fragments of glass that glittered faintly in the dawn light like a field of tiny graves. His position was completely exposed, barely 30 yards from a narrow bridge the Germans were expected to cross. No sandbags, no cover, no reinforcements coming. Just the broken stone of a dead factory and a desperate plan scrawled out in the last seconds before chaos arrived. In that moment, Francis Curry wasn't a hero. He was a 19-year-old kid, shivering from cold and fear, his heartbeat loud enough to drown out thought. The other anti-tank crews had been wiped out or forced to retreat. And now, somewhere beyond the trees, the low growl of Panzer engines, those steel beasts of the Wehrmacht, was growing louder, closer. If they crossed that bridge, they would trap the wounded men behind him and split open the American line like ice, cracking under weight. Curry could have run. Every instinct in his body told him to, but he didn't. Instead, he stayed. He knelt in the snow, steadied the launcher on a piece of rubble, and sighted toward the bridge. It was a position no sane man would have chosen. Too close, too open, too certain of death. But in war, courage and madness often share the same breath. Curry didn't wait for orders. He didn't expect to survive. And somehow, over the next 3 hours, one 19-year-old rifleman would hold the line against a German armored advance, alone. Francis Sherman Curry was born on June 29, 1925, in the small town of Loch Sheldrake, New York, a quiet place of pine forests, frozen lakes, and simple people. Lost his father at 12, a loss that left an invisible mark that never quite faded. Raised by his mother and grandmother, young Francis grew up with the habits of solitude. He built tree forts, wandered the woods for hours, fixed broken tools with scraps of wire. He wasn't a scholar or an athlete, just a boy who learned early that work and silence could carry you through most things. When war came, he tried to enlist at 17, but was turned away, too young. So he waited. On his 18th birthday, he walked straight back to the recruiter's office and joined the U.S. Army. He was trained as a rifleman, shipped overseas in early 1944 with the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory. By December, he'd fought across France, the Netherlands, and into Germany. He'd seen friends fall. He'd seen towns burn. He'd learned that courage often felt like fear that had nowhere left to go. But nothing in all of that prepared him for what was waiting in the frozen woods of the Ardennes. That winter, Adolf Hitler launched his last great gamble on the Western Front, the counteroffensive that history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. 200,000 German troops pushed through the Ardennes under cover of snow and fog, a desperate attempt to split the Allied lines and capture Antwerp before the year's end. The Americans were exhausted, stretched thin, and unaware of the storm about to break over them. Curry's unit, Company K, 120th Infantry Regiment, was stationed near Malmedy. Their orders were simple: hold the road network that fed deeper into Allied territory. But simple orders rarely mean simple battles. Just beyond the forest, elite panzer divisions were advancing, their crews veterans hardened by years on the Eastern Front. They had orders to break through by Christmas. When the first artillery fell, it was like the sky tearing apart. American anti-tank guns were destroyed in minutes. Communications went dark, units scattered, and when the smoke cleared, Curry and a handful of survivors found themselves defending a narrow bridge beside a ruined factory, facing a road now alive with German armor. The snow kept falling, muting the sound, softening the edges of the world. It made everything seem slower, quieter, except the pounding of his own heart. At 6:28 a.m., the silence broke. It began with the low mechanical growl of engines, a deep, vibrating sound that lived somewhere between thunder and dread. Then came the crunch of boots over ice, muffled orders in German, the rhythmic clank of treads cutting through the frost. Curry crawled to the edge of the broken doorway and peered out. Through the drifting snow, he saw them, a line of infantry and tanks moving in perfect, practiced coordination. The lead Panzer Mark V loomed at the front, its guns scanning from side to side like the slow, searching gaze of a predator. There was no time left. Curry glanced back. Behind him, inside the factory's shattered walls, 5 wounded Americans lay pinned beneath debris. They couldn't move. They couldn't fight. If the panzers reached the bridge, the column would roll over them, crush the position, and open the road. He turned back toward the sound of engines and made his choice. A frontal assault with a single bazooka was suicide. But there was one chance, one precise angle near the bridge where the tanks would be forced to slow, their thick frontal armor exposed just enough for a hit. It wasn't a position that offered survival, but it offered purpose. And so, Curry dragged the heavy launcher through the rubble, every motion stiff and clumsy from the cold. His gloves were torn. His fingers felt carved from wood. He steadied himself behind a collapsed beam, sighted the road, and waited. 10 seconds, maybe less. Then it came. The Panzer appeared, its metal hide glistening with frost, its tracks grinding like teeth over the frozen ground. Curry exhaled slowly. His breath fogged the sight. He squeezed the trigger. The bazooka bucked against his shoulder with a hollow roar. The rocket streaked forward, a brief flare of fire against the white snow, and struck the tank's side with a sound that seemed to swallow the air. A bloom of smoke and flame rose from the turret. The Panzer jerked, halted, and went still. German shouts filled the road. Curry didn't wait to see what happened next. He dropped the launcher and sprinted back toward the factory, weaving through falling snow and shards of stone as machine gun fire tore into the air around him. Inside, he grabbed a Browning automatic rifle and fired through the shattered windows, his rounds cutting through the confusion. Then he seized a .30 caliber machine gun mounted on a wrecked jeep and turned it toward the bridge, spraying fire to keep the enemy pinned. The recoil hammered through his arms. The sound was deafening, steady, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of defiance itself. The Germans regrouped. Another panzer rolled forward, slower this time, probing for the source of the attack. Curry knew he couldn't reload the bazooka fast enough. So he crawled through a hole in the wall, dragging himself through frozen mud to a position even closer to the road. He found another rocket beside the body of a fallen comrade, jammed it into the tube, and waited. The world narrowed to his breath and the low, inexorable sound of the tank drawing near. It came into view less than 20 yards away, its engine growling like something alive. Curry waited for the right moment, aimed low, and fired. The second rocket struck true. Another flash, another echo that rolled across the valley. Flames licked the steel. The second Panzer stopped moving. Panic spread through the column. Unsure of what they faced, the remaining crews began to fall back. Infantry ducked for cover. A third tank reversed down the road, and just like that, the advance stalled. One young soldier, with a borrowed bazooka and no backup, had bought 3 hours of life for the men behind him, and perhaps, without knowing it, changed the course of the battle. Snow continued to fall, silent and steady, covering the burned metal and frozen ground. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of engines retreated into the forest, and for a moment, just a moment, the world held still. The only sound left was the slow, uneven rhythm of Francis Curry's breath, and the soft ticking of cooling steel. He crawled back into the shattered skeleton of the factory, where the wounded Americans still lay trapped beneath the rubble. The air inside was thick with dust and the bitter scent of burnt oil, a kind of darkness that clung to the lungs. Through it, Francis Curry moved with quiet urgency, his boots crunching over glass, his breath rasping against the cold. Despite the danger outside, despite the fact that each second spent here could be his last, he didn't leave them. Using a bent metal beam, he pried up slabs of fallen masonry, one after another, until his muscles burned. Stone by stone, he freed his comrades, dragging them toward the shelter of broken walls and covering them with anything he could find. Doors torn from their hinges, chunks of timber, the wreckage of what had once been a roof. He gave them water from his canteen, checked their pulses with trembling hands, and whispered the only words that mattered in that frozen place. "Help is coming. Hold on." Outside, the world trembled. The whistle of falling shells drew closer, followed by the heavy, bone-deep thud of German mortars striking nearby. The factory shook like a living thing. Dust fell in curtains from the beams above, and pieces of concrete shattered around him. But Curry stayed where he was, shielding the wounded with his body when the blasts grew near. Then, over the howl of the wind and the mechanical rumble of the earth, he heard a sound that froze the air in his lungs, the metallic whine of tank treads repositioning. Somewhere to the north, another panzer was moving, circling, hunting for a new angle. He looked around. The bazooka lay empty. No more rockets, no grenades, no reinforcements coming through the static of the broken radio. Just one young soldier, 5 wounded men, and the sound of steel closing in. But Curry's eyes caught something through the smoke. A few yards from the bridge, half buried in snow, stood the carcass of a destroyed American half-track. Its hull was warped and burned, but mounted on top was a Browning .50 caliber machine gun. If it still worked, it could hold back infantry, maybe even dent the armor of a light panzer. The problem was distance. To reach it, Curry would have to run across open ground, fully visible under direct fire. It was suicide. He stared at the wounded for a long moment, then at the bridge. The sound of tank treads grew louder. He exhaled through chattering teeth, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and whispered to himself, almost tenderly, "Let's finish this." Then he ran straight into the storm. The world became a blur of motion and sound. The frozen earth cracked beneath his boots. Bullets snapped through the air, hot and fast, slicing through steam vents and ricocheting off iron beams. Behind him, the mortar shells fell like thunder, sending sprays of snow and mud high into the air. He didn't stop, couldn't stop. The half-track loomed ahead, a wreck of twisted metal and scorched paint. Its side armor melted from a direct hit. But the gun still stood like a survivor. Curry pulled himself onto the mangled chassis, the metal biting into his palms through torn gloves. The moment his helmet rose above the frame, rifles cracked from across the road. He dropped flat, breath ragged, hands shaking. Then he reached for the Browning's bolt and pulled. It slid free with a solid, living click, not jammed, still breathing. The 50 cal roared to life with a sound that could have shaken the heavens. It was thunder and heartbeat, and fury rolled into one. Muzzle fire strobed against the snow as Curry swept the barrel across the road. German infantry scattered, their advance broken in an instant. Vehicles reversed in confusion. A panzer trying to flank halted abruptly, its crew bailing as the heavy rounds slammed into its side. For a moment, it wasn't a 19-year-old firing that weapon. It was the entire weight of resistance, the will to stand when everything else had fallen. Each tracer round carved red streaks through the fog, glowing lines that stitched the morning sky. Sparks danced off the half-track's battered frame. The gun grew hot, steaming in the cold air, but Curry didn't stop. For 20 minutes, he held that ground, sweeping left, then right, cutting through waves of advancing soldiers, keeping the bridge untouched. Behind him, the 5 wounded men still lived. Not a single panzer crossed. Then silence, an unnatural pause between heartbeats. The Browning shuddered, coughed smoke, and jammed. The barrel glowed dull orange in the half-light. Curry kicked the release lever, slung himself off the wreck, and dove into a frozen ditch as bullets tore the ground behind him. He landed hard, chest heaving, the cold biting deep. Somewhere near his collar, blood trickled from a shallow cut. The air stank of burning oil. He could hear officers shouting in German, the rhythm of command, urgent and angry. The tanks were repositioning again. His legs ached, his hands were raw, his helmet was gone. And still, he refused to quit. For the next 2 hours, Francis Curry fought like a shadow. He moved between collapsed buildings, crawling through basements, firing through shattered windows. He scavenged ammunition from the fallen, reloading by touch, his fingers numb and clumsy. In one corner, he found an M1 Garand, still warm, still ready. From a half-collapsed window frame, he used it to pick off advancing infantry, one shot at a time, calm and measured. He hurled grenades at supply trucks that dared, too close. He shot out the tires of a Kubelwagen as it tried to flank. Once, he found a single rocket, just one, inside the wreckage of a Jeep. He dragged it back through the snow, fitted it into his old bazooka, and took position near the same doorway where it all began. Then he waited. The next tank came cautiously, its turret sweeping from side to side, as if it could sense that the silence ahead was unnatural. Curry didn't move, didn't breathe. When the Panzer turned slightly, exposing its side, he fired. The rocket streaked across the air and struck home. Smoke and flame blossomed like a storm breaking open. The tank lurched, its tracks grinding to a stop. Crewmen spilled out into the snow, dazed, crawling. Curry raised his rifle and fired a single round at one of the officers, catching him in the leg. The man collapsed, screaming, and then something remarkable. The German line hesitated. They realized the truth. There was no platoon here, no reinforced position. Just one man, one 19-year-old standing alone. And still, they couldn't take him. By now, Curry's uniform was shredded. A sleeve hung loose, torn nearly to the shoulder. Blood soaked his left leg where a bullet had grazed him. His hands were blistered and raw from the heat of the guns. His voice had worn down to a whisper, but he didn't stop. In one surreal instant, while crouched behind a wall, he turned and saw a German soldier barely 15 feet away, young, pale, eyes wide, rifle trembling in his hands. The man didn't fire, neither did Curry. For a heartbeat, both soldiers simply stared, two ghosts meeting in the fog. Then, wordlessly, they turned and ran in opposite directions. For that single second, the war itself seemed to hesitate, tired, broken, human. At 9:15 that morning, the final push came. 3 tanks rolled forward in a staggered line, infantry spreading to the sides, covering fire crackling through the ruins. Curry had almost nothing left. His Garand, a handful of magazines, and his will. He crawled to an upper window, rested the rifle on the sill, and aimed at the open hatches of the lead tanks. He squeezed the trigger. One of the commanders fell backward from his turret, vanishing from sight. The Panzer halted, turret spinning in confusion. And then, a distant sound, low, rhythmic, rising from beyond the hills. American artillery, the deep, slow thunder of salvation. Shells began to fall in the distance, each one a heartbeat closer. Curry ducked, covered his ears, and waited as the sky opened above the enemy line. The German formation fractured. Officers shouted orders to retreat. Tanks reversed. Infantry scattered for the trees. And then, at last, there was nothing. Just the wind, the snow, and the faint ringing in his ears. By 9:30, the road was clear. Curry limped back toward the factory, his steps uneven, his breath shallow. The doorway yawned open, dark against the pale light. Inside, the 5 wounded men were still, alive, barely conscious but breathing. He sank down beside them, his back to the wall, eyes half closed. Through the broken roof, snow fell gently, settling on his shoulders, soft and quiet as sleep. For the first time in 3 hours, no one was firing. They had survived because one 19-year-old kid from New York had decided not to run. He had stayed, fought, stood alone, and in doing so, he had turned the tide of a battle. When the smoke cleared, Curry didn't feel victorious. He didn't even feel relief. He felt the ache of a body pushed beyond its limit, the hollow fatigue of survival. His leg throbbed, his arms burned, his face was streaked with soot. He hadn't slept in nearly 2 days, hadn't eaten in 1. The adrenaline that had kept him alive was fading, replaced by the cold, the kind that seeped through bone and memory alike. And yet, the bridge was still there, intact, unbroken, the road beyond it, silent. Behind him, 5 wounded men breathing softly in the dark. Ahead, the snow falling gently over twisted steel and empty helmets. For the first time that morning, no tanks growled, no boots struck stone, no mortars fell. Only the soft hiss of snow landing on metal, still warm from battle. He looked toward the bridge, that narrow strip of Belgian stone that had held the weight of so much hope and fear. It stood untouched, as if the war itself had paused just short of it. The men he saved would live, the division would hold, and somewhere, far behind the lines, the world would keep turning because for 3 hours, one soldier refused to let it end here. The silence after battle has its own kind of sound. That morning, it sounded like snow melting on steel. His resistance had delayed the German column just long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the rear. Later, when officers studied the field reports, they realized what those 3 hours had meant. The enemy formation that had attacked Curry's position was forced to divert south, where it was later pinned down and obliterated by a combination of American artillery and the sharp descending strike of Allied air power. That morning, one 19-year-old private had unknowingly bought the U.S. Army time that bent the course of a battle, time that helped fracture one of the last furious thrusts of Hitler's winter gamble. But Francis Sherman Curry didn't know any of that. Not then. All he knew, as the snow settled and the light grew pale over the wreckage, was that they were still alive. He sat down beside the wounded, too weak to speak, too cold to tremble anymore. The silence felt heavier than the gunfire ever had. For a few long minutes, they leaned on one another, half-conscious, exhausted, shaking from cold and the impossible weight of having survived. When the first American patrol finally pushed through the battered village, they found Curry standing. His rifle hung low, his face streaked with dirt and dried blood. He was giving water from his canteen to one of the men he had saved. The officer in charge, a captain with snow clinging to his helmet, asked, "Who's in command here?" Curry paused for a moment, looked around at the frozen ruins, then answered simply, "I don't know. I was just trying to keep them alive." Those words, quiet, honest, stripped of heroism, would become the truest measure of the man. In the days that followed, as officers and engineers inspected the scene, they began to piece together what had happened: the destroyed tanks, the half-track torn open, the recovered bazooka, the bridge, still standing, the German retreat that had begun, almost unbelievably, from a single gunner's defiance. Eyewitnesses confirmed it all: multiple enemy vehicles destroyed, wounded soldiers rescued under fire, a bridge held by one man against a mechanized assault. But when people tried to speak to Francis Curry about it, he never used the word hero. To him, it was just what the moment demanded: no speeches, no boasting. He'd done his duty, nothing more, nothing less. The men he saved recovered, went home, saw their families again. That narrow road of frozen Belgian stone, just a few hundred feet of history, remained in Allied hands for the rest of the war. Curry's stand hadn't just saved lives, it had frozen the enemy in their tracks, in every sense of the word. And it proved something larger, something timeless. That in the chaos of war, with nothing left but instinct and the stubborn will to survive, one 19-year-old with a borrowed bazooka could stop an entire armored advance, could shape the course of a battle, could remind the world what courage looked like when stripped to its essence. Word of Curry's actions spread quickly. Within hours, his superiors gathered statements, testimonies, and sketches of the battle site. The wreckage itself told the story: blackened tanks, broken weapons, twisted tracks, and, improbably, 5 wounded men alive in a place that should have been consumed. When the reports reached Division Command, the gravity of it all began to sink in. This was not just bravery. It was the kind of solitary defiance that stood out even in the brutal arithmetic of the Ardennes. A formal citation was drafted. It documented every verified detail: how Curry used a bazooka to destroy at least one enemy tank, fired both a Browning automatic rifle and a .50 caliber machine gun at exposed positions under direct fire, rescued 5 wounded comrades, and single-handedly stalled an armored advance. Less than 6 months later, on July 27, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented Francis Sherman Curry with the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration of the United States military. The citation read, in part, "Sergeant Curry's conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself, the 30th Infantry Division, and the United States Army." Curry was just 20 years old. He returned home not with the swagger of a hero, but with the quiet composure of a man who had done what needed doing. In interviews, when journalists tried to draw out grand tales, he gave them none. He said simply, "I just did what had to be done." After the war, Francis went back to New York, not the loud parades of New York City, but the gentler rhythm of upstate towns, Hurleyville, South Bethlehem, where the seasons turned slowly and people remembered names. He worked for many years at the Department of Veterans Affairs in Albany, helping other servicemen find their footing again, guiding them through the tangle of post-war life, benefits, rehabilitation, the long road home. He spent his life serving those who had served, without ever seeking attention for himself. He turned down parades, declined speeches. When local newspapers asked for interviews, he often said no. Yet his story lingered, quietly, respectfully, like the echo of a steady drumbeat beneath the noise of history. In 2009, his hometown honored him by naming their post office the Francis S. Curry Post Office. Later, in Buffalo's Casanova Park, they raised a statue of him, bronze cast in mid-motion, Curry, 19 years old again, bracing a bazooka under fire. It wasn't about glorifying the violence of war. It was about remembering the moment when courage outweighed fear. He remained one of the youngest Medal of Honor recipients of World War II, and by the early 2000s, one of the last living. On October 8, 2019, at the age of 94, Francis Sherman Curry passed away. To the very end, he carried himself not as a legend, but as a veteran, one who knew the true cost of war, not counted in medals or monuments or headlines, but in the names that never left his memory, the friends who didn't come home. After the war, Curry could have chosen a different life. He could have gone on speaking tours, written a book, lived under the warm light of public recognition. America would have gladly celebrated him, but he didn't. He returned to quiet service instead, to paperwork and phone calls, to helping aging veterans find care. For more than 30 years, he worked inside the Department of Veterans Affairs, helping others navigate the maze of recovery. He rarely talked about the war, not because it haunted him, but because he believed his duty wasn't to retell it, but to keep serving. People who knew him described a soft-spoken man, polite and unassuming. He kept his Medal of Honor not in a display case, but in a drawer. He wore it only when duty required. Those who met him never forgot his gentleness, the way he smiled at children, the patience in his voice when explaining things to older veterans, the simplicity with which he spoke about life and loss. He never referred to himself as a hero. He had lived long enough to understand that real heroism had nothing to do with applause. It lived in the small acts, the unseen moments, the quiet choices. In a time when fame often outshines service, Francis Curry's life stands as a reminder of another kind of greatness, the kind built not from words or spotlight, but from integrity. His heroism wasn't a performance. It was a decision made in the freezing mud, under enemy fire, with no thought of recognition. There's something profoundly American about that, the belief that courage can come from anyone, anywhere, when it's needed most. Over the decades, Curry's story found its way into classrooms, into officer training programs, into leadership seminars. Teachers spoke of him not as a symbol of victory, but as an embodiment of integrity. His name became shorthand for doing what's right when no one is watching. He didn't win his battle by being the strongest or best armed. He won it by staying calm in crisis, by being prepared, and by remembering who he was fighting for, not for glory, not for vengeance, but for the men beside him. In a world often hungry for heroes made of spectacle, Francis Curry offers a humbler truth. Leadership, he showed us, doesn't always shout commands from the front. Sometimes it crawls through debris to pull another man to safety. Sometimes it stands in a doorway with no promise of survival, simply because running would betray something deeper. And sometimes it's a 19-year-old kid facing tanks alone because, in his heart, he knows there's no one else left to do it. In his later years, when asked again about that morning in Belgium, Curry smiled faintly and said, "I just did what had to be done." That simple sentence holds the whole of him. Duty without ego, courage without applause, humility without weakness. And maybe that's the lesson. That history isn't shaped by those who chase remembrance, but by those who act when everything inside them screams to run. We live now in comfort, surrounded by distractions, choices, endless noise. Few of us will ever face the kind of decision Francis Curry made on that cold December morning in 1944. Few will stand alone between destruction and the lives behind them. But his story remains, steady as the sound of snow falling on metal, reminding us that even in the darkest hours, the measure of a man is found not in what he gains, but in what he's willing to give. And yet, his story leaves behind a question that lingers long after the echoes of battle fade. What do you do when no one tells you what to do? When the handbook runs out, when command is silent, and the only voice left is the quiet insistence of your own conscience? What do you do when every part of you wants to run, but the moment demands that you stay? Francis Curry didn't hold off a Panzer Advance because he was the most decorated or best-trained soldier on the field. He wasn't fearless. In fact, he was 19, just old enough to understand how mortal he was and young enough to believe that standing his ground still mattered. He held that bridge not out of confidence, but out of conviction, because when everything collapsed, orders, plans, hope, he made a choice. And that, perhaps, is the real heart of this story. A single choice, made in a blizzard of chaos, with no promise of survival, no audience, and no reward. We all encounter moments like that, moments without fanfare or witnesses, where the path ahead is uncertain, where the safe thing to do would be to step back and wait for someone else to decide. But courage, as history quietly teaches, is often nothing more than the act of staying when every instinct says, go. Curry's suicidal angle, as one officer later called it, wasn't just a tactical position on a battlefield. It became something greater, a metaphor for every impossible choice that still must be made. The kind of decision that looks hopeless on paper, reckless to the observer, but necessary to the person who understands what's truly at stake. That's why this story endures, not because of explosions or medals, but because of the simplicity behind his reason. He saw 5 wounded men behind him, men who couldn't move, couldn't defend themselves, and German tanks closing in ahead. Between them and death stood one man with a borrowed bazooka. And so, without orders, without guarantees, he decided, no one else is coming, so I will stay. We often imagine courage as loud, fireworks of action, shouting across the noise of war. But the truth is quieter. Sometimes, courage looks like a 19-year-old private kneeling in the snow, hands trembling from cold and fear, staring down a steel monster with a weapon he barely knows how to use, knowing full well that he may not live 5 more minutes, and still pulling the trigger anyway. That's courage, that's character, and that's why his story matters, not just to historians or soldiers, but to anyone who's ever stood on the edge of an impossible decision. It's not a story about war. It's a story about choice, about the kind of quiet strength that surfaces when no one is watching, when there's no script, no applause, no one left to tell you what's right. In every life, there are moments like Curry's. They might not involve rifles or rockets. Maybe it's a decision at work, a promise kept when it's easier to quit, standing up for someone who can't stand up for themselves. But the weight of that choice feels the same. Because in the end, courage doesn't care about uniforms or medals. It lives in the small, unseen places where a man or a woman simply decides to do what must be done. We often celebrate heroes for what they achieve, but what makes Francis Curry unforgettable is why he acted. He wasn't thinking of glory. He wasn't thinking of history. He was thinking of the men depending on him, their faces, their voices, the promise that if he could just hold the line a little longer, they might live to see another dawn. And that is the kind of heroism the world rarely notices but always remembers. His suicidal angle became more than a story of war. It became a parable for character itself. Because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing your duty in spite of it. It's standing still while the world breaks around you. So now, as the snow has long melted and the battlefield is quiet, that question remains, passing like a torch across generations. What would you do? If you found yourself in that shattered factory with 5 wounded friends behind you and the sound of engines approaching through the fog, if the road in front of you meant certain death and retreat meant abandoning the ones who trusted you, what would your choice be? Would you stay? Would you fight? Or would you, like so many others before you, hope that someone else might step forward? Sometimes the stories that whisper the quietest carry the loudest lessons. And sometimes the smallest choices, the ones no one sees, no one records, no one celebrates are the very ones that shape the world that comes after. Outside, the wind moves across the ruins of Malmedy. Snow drifts where steel once burned. Somewhere, faintly, you can almost hear the hum of an engine fading into silence.